Greetings all, here we go, more on stimulus control. Alright, now what we want to think about here is that, this chapter really talks about antecedent control and things like that, but functionally what this is looking at modifying things that happen before your behavior in order to change your behavior or change the consequences for your behavior or put you in touch with new consequences. In other words, we're going to play around with stimulus control, okay? So we can use stimulus control to help us deal with difficult situations. There are all sorts of scenarios where something may be challenging for us and we're having difficulty performing a particular task, or a learner is having a difficulty performing a particular task, but we can use some sort of stimulus control to help them get through that because the behavior may already be happening. Right? We'll get to performances here because that one works pretty well. So does sports. I'm just not a sports guy, so we'll come back to it though. Right? So performances, if you think about the slide here, right, you've got this microphone, and if you just get up and give a talk in front of it, let's say 1,000 people, that's probably going to be a bit unnerving, right? Especially if you haven't had a lot of practice with it. Okay? Sorry, it's actually really early in the morning. I'm going to have to drink a lot of coffee to keep excited here. But again, at performances, if you're giving a talk in front of, like I said, 1,000 people, it's going to be nerve-wracking, and you may stumble a little bit, you may fumble a little bit. In fact, you've heard me fumble quite a bit on these lectures. And part of the reason that I fumble on the lectures isn't because I don't know the content. It's because I have no stimulus control, right? What's my stimulus control when I'm giving a lecture to the computer? The machine. Right, I may have the slides, but that's not what's under control here. It seems to me that the discussion, the interaction that I have with you guys as students, historically, is what kind of cues me to say the next thing. Because believe it or not, I use your visual responses in the classroom. Like if you get that sort of flat affect look that's just like, I have no idea what you're saying, then if I see that on 5 or 10 people, then I'm going to restate what I'm doing or what I'm saying. It's a little different when I'm doing it this way because I have no idea how you're reacting to this. Of course, you can rewind it, and I don't really have to restate stuff. Or rewind, it's kind of an old term. Anyway, but you can back up the file, and you can play it again, and you can hear what I've said, so I don't really have to restate things, which kind of makes me fumble it along the way. I have lost that stimulus control, but we can twist this around, right? So we can spin this whole thing and go the other direction. Let's say that I have practiced giving lectures in a small group sense. What I can do is when I transfer out to a large classroom or a large setting, or maybe I'm going to be presenting at a large conference, maybe I can take something with me that is the same stimulus that I had when I give it in that small group setting. So, for example, maybe I've got the same set of slides. That's pretty straightforward. Maybe I've got the same set of cue cards. That's great. Or maybe I even have something as cheesy as a little rabbit's foot. Right? Anything that I can use to connect my behavior back to that original performance. Right? So, can I use some stimulus out there? Can I, and that's the idea behind these lecture notes or the PowerPoints and things. And like I said, maybe it's the rabbit's foot. If the rabbit's foot is always with me, I can kind of use that to cue myself what to do. It's like, all right, when I get to this section, I know that I need to hold the rabbit's foot this way, and that will remind me to do X, something like that. And it sounds kind of goofy on the surface, but that's really what it's all about, is having the environment select for the proper response. And if I already learned one response, that response is obviously connected with something. What you want to do is try and bring that something with you to those new locations, and then the behavior is going to be more likely to be performed. So let's think about this from a sports perspective, right? How could we do this in sports? What do you think? See, this is one of those scenarios where I would have expected you to respond back to me, and it would have cued me to say something else. So I will just move on. Ha 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 ha. Anyway, so sports, like imagining things, right? I think your book talks about a guy that goes through he's doing some self-practice with golf, and it's about goal-setting behavior and all that stuff, which we'll get into in a minute. But the idea is that he imagines himself at the U.S. Open, and it's like he's got the one putt to go, and to stay in the lead, he's got to make this putt, that sort of goofy thing. And it sounds kind of funny on the surface, but and it kind of works, right? But it doesn't work for everybody in all settings. It takes actually practice to make that stuff work. That imagery type procedure, but when he then goes out and performs that task in the real world, under pressure, so to speak, he will have already practiced under pressure. So that the stimulus control is already there. He already knows what that feeling might be like when he's got to make that putt to stay in the lead. All right, speeches, performances. I just went through that one. So the question ultimately becomes, when you're trying to modify existing behavior, can I use some discriminative stimulus out there to help me? Right? Can I add a new discriminative stimulus, right, to pull out a response that maybe it hasn't been present, so to speak, but it could be, like the behavior is in your repertoire and it happens in one context but not another. So is there a way I can bring that one context to the new one, right? Or the other way around, right? Can I get rid of a stimulus that is selecting for a particular response? And sometimes the answer is yes. So you can go both directions here. Right? Rules. Now, there's been, interestingly enough, this is one of those ones that like 5 people have come to talk to me about in my office, because for some reason it seems to be an interesting sort of thing. So we'll go through rules a little bit more here, and hopefully this lecture will clarify some of what I've said in the office and some of what I've said in the class. Okay. Now, if you look in that picture on there, and you might have to look close depending on the connection and how good this video ends up being, but you'll notice 1, 2, 3, 4 rocks that are painted red. Right? I'm gonna let you think about that for a second. This is a real picture, by the way. This is not made up. This isn't photoshopped. And I will tell you that this is taken in the eastern provinces in Afghanistan. So anybody know what those rocks are saying? Because it's a rule. What do you think about it? All right, the red rocks are a rule for mines. It's like, don't walk here. That's kind of what the rule is. Now, interestingly enough, you can't really see it, but there's actually writing on those rocks. So the rule is actually written verbally here as well, and it's written in Dari and it's written in Pashto, and no one writes it in English for whatever reason, but probably because there's not many native English speakers living around those parts. But what they do is when you have a minefield, or when you have a field that hasn't been demined, right? And you got to remember that Afghanistan was so heavily, it's the heaviest mined country in the world, and the demining there is still going to take like another 5 or 10 years, and it's been going on for 10 years. Okay, so everywhere you walk, especially when you're out in the sticks or out in the boonies, there's guaranteed to be mines unless it's been demined. So what they do is that the demining folks, they'll come through and they'll clear the sides of roads, right? So they'll clear the first 50 meters on either side of a road. And that's kind of the low-hanging fruit, and it keeps a lot of people safe, because not many folks are going to be out walking through the countryside. But then they put these red rocks for areas where there are likely mines, where they've found mines nearby, but they have not demined this area. So it's basically a rule saying, don't go in here. And if you go in here, you may die, right? Now, some people go, well, no, it's a discriminative stimulus, and it's really not. And the reason it's not is because if it was an SD, and I guess it could be in this case, but then it would signal that you're going to get reinforced for something. And it is kind of that, because there's the negative reinforcement of avoiding the field and avoiding the death and all that stuff, but that all implies that it's going to have to happen multiple times, and the probabilities in death is like less than a one-shot deal. Okay, so they really are more of a rule per se. Okay? So I've always talked about how rules need to be verbal. Here's one case where they actually don't, where that signal is telling you something else. But in order for that to work, in order for those red rocks to work, I had to tell you this story. Because if you're just cruising down the street in Afghanistan, you're heading over to Logar province or something like that, or actually like where this picture is, heading out to Nangarhar University. So heading out east to Jalalabad, this is right alongside one of the major highways. You wouldn't know what those are. You'd need somebody to explain it to you. And once they explain it to you, you're like, okay, I get it. Not going anywhere near the red rocks. This is more, it's frustratingly common to see these red rocks over there. In fact, there's even some out by the golf course. So there's another rule that exists over there that's just kind of funny, is that if you see, what is it? If you see sheep droppings in the rocks, right? So if you've got these red rocks, but on the other side there's sheep droppings, like in the background here, there's a bunch of sheep droppings, you're okay. You can ignore the red rocks because the sheep would have blown up any of the mines. Anyway, that's kind of one of those crazy things. I'm going to take a pause here for a moment. Okay, so let's just keep cruising forward now that we know all about sheep poop and red rocks in Afghanistan, right? I don't like what your book talks about in one sense. In another sense, it's nice, it's great. But your book uses the term rule-governed behavior, okay? That implies that the rule actually has some power over you. It is this governing power that's going to just like punish you and tax you and all these different things, right? So in other words, joking aside, it's saying that the rule has the strength and the rule is what is controlling your behavior, right? In reality, it's not. Rule-governed behavior is better described as rule-following behavior. And the reason that I say that, and the reason that the handful of us, not, well, more than a handful of us, a majority of us behavior analysts now usually use the term rule-following behavior, is because we know that rule-following is a behavior that by itself can be reinforced or punished. You can get reinforced for following the rules. You can actually get punished for following the rules. Imagine that. If you follow the rules and for whatever reason the rules didn't work for you, and you still ran into a problem or something like that, then guess what? Rule following behavior is going to decrease. So rule following is what I'll tend to use. Now I'll bounce back and forth in the slides, and I know there's a couple of slides that say rule governed behavior. I slip back into that because that's the way I was originally trained, and because it is. We all know what we're talking about when we say rule-governed behavior. It's because we're setting up a scenario that we'll talk about in a little bit. But just keep in mind that I prefer the term rule-following behavior, and it gets you to focus on the idea that is in this point, which is that the behavior itself of following rules is usually well-developed as you grow older, right? But it's something that you learn throughout life. Right? Ultimately, what happens with following the rules is it gives you access to more reinforcers. And it allows you to avoid punishers. If you follow the rules on the road, right, you're likely to avoid punishment. When you avoid punishment, then you are getting negatively reinforced, right? You're avoiding some stimulus that's probably aversive, like a ticket or an accident or something like that. When you listen to what somebody else is telling you, in terms of somebody trying to teach you a skill, and I say, here's a rule for you, and follow that rule and things will work. Okay? And that tends to be the case. Like apprentices have to follow a lot of rules, and they follow the rules because they don't want to have to learn the hard way, so to speak. So by following the rules, you get in contact with those reinforcers much quicker. And we'll talk about some of those in a minute. Clear rules for the consequences are always best. Okay. Don't hand plane against the grain. You guys are going, what the hell is he talking about now? No, point simple, hand planes, and the idea is you're trying to smooth out a piece of wood. Well, you have to read the edge of the wood in the direction that the grain's going. So assuming you're going to go with the grain, always, you can never really go cross grain, there's no reason to do that. So you're going with the grain. Now there's still another direction that the grain's going. The grain isn't always parallel with the surface of the wood. It's usually going down into the wood or up against the wood. So the idea is that you need to follow the grain in a way that won't cause it to tear away from the wood underneath it. You want to slice it off, but you don't want to tear it out. Right? So when we talk about, and this is almost impossible to do without looking at a piece of wood, but ultimately what we do is we say, plane with the grain of the wood, read the wood. And those are rules that we use to help people come in contact with the reinforcers of having a smooth finish if you're doing hand planing. Right? So clear rules for the consequences are always the best. The rules here for the red rocks, pretty straightforward. Don't go in here, otherwise you will die or lose a limb or something like that. That's pretty clear. It's not like saying, ooh, look at the pretty red rocks. There might be something behind them. Hint, hint. That's a bad rule. That's not a good thing that you want to tell people. First off, it's just mean. Second off, it's just not clear. Unclear ones do work. They just typically don't work as well, and they have a tendency to be easily, rule-following behavior from unclear rules tends to be punished rather quickly or extinguished rather quickly because you don't always come in contact with the reinforcers. And there's the whole threat or command thing. If you're going to threaten somebody, and they don't do what you're telling them to do, you actually have to follow through with the threat, because if you don't follow through with that threat, then it makes those rules completely ineffective. So if I say, I want you to study this material or else, it's like, well, what the hell's the or else? And what am I going to do to you, right? So let's say I do, do something like freak out and spray a bunch of water on the class because you guys didn't study properly, right? Now I've at least followed through on my threat. But I'm not going to do that, so I'm not going to give you those types of threats. So, because if I gave you the threat and then didn't follow through, then you now know that my rules are just pointless. The same thing goes with commands. Okay? Let's look at something called contingency-shaped behavior versus rule-governed behavior, or rule-following behavior. Some people like to joke around and call this real behavior versus artificial behavior. I say hogwash behavior is behavior. There may be different things that led to it, but it's always going to be reinforced ultimately. So contingency shaped is behavior that happened through, lack of a better term, trial and error. This is the stuff that got you where you got punished and reinforced for doing particular things, and you had no sort of clear indication about what to do, right? There was no clear rule, so you didn't follow any rules, you just got out there and tried it. I've had this happen a couple of times in woodwork. I learned woodworking from my uncle, and he died when I was quite young. But before that, he taught me quite a few things. But he also didn't teach me a lot of stuff, partially because I was just too young when he was teaching me these things, and I didn't have the sort of dexterity to be handling an object that's sharper than a razor, or working with a power tool that can twist me across the room when I'm 10 years old. So he didn't teach me some of these things. So when I got out and started doing woodworking, I didn't really have a mentor anymore. And one of the things that I noticed was that I make a lot of mistakes, a lot more than what the average Joe does when they go through a woodworking class. And I started thinking about it, and I'm like, it's because it's contingency shaped. It's because I'm having to learn to do this thing from scratch. I don't have any rules to follow. I don't have any guidelines. I didn't buy any books. I'm stubborn, so I could have went out there and bought books and learned a few things that way. Or if I would have been thinking, I'd have gone on YouTube and typed in some of those, typed in some of the things that I was doing, and picked up on some rules to kind of help bridge some of the gaps. I didn't do that. Okay? So contingency shaped is about coming into contact with a particular contingency. So you want to learn how to use a router, little thing, spends about 15,000 RPM, got a nice sharp bit on the end of it. I'm laughing because even just the other day I had a contingency happen with the router. Like I said, thing's spinning, it's a little blade, it's a little bit, right? It's spinning on this thing like 15,000 RPM. That was the speed that I was running for this particular project. And I went the wrong direction. Now, I'm not stupid. I've done this 1,000 times. But I went the wrong direction. And when you go the wrong direction, if you don't go against that rotation, right, then in other words, if you go with the rotation, then it tends to grab the wood and pull it and throw it across the shop. Well, the danger there is that when it throws it across the shop, you're still trying to hold on to it, so it pulls your fingers into that bit, right? Luckily, it didn't pull my fingers into it, but it yanked the wood out of my hands and threw it across the shop and broke the piece of wood, which was frustrating because then I had to spend the next 2 hours rebuilding that piece in order to get it back through the router again. So that's an example of contingency shape. So with that particular piece, I'm definitely not going to do what's called climb milling, right? So certain times you do want to go with the rotation, but you have to be set up for that. You got to be ready for it. You got to know that it's going to try and pull it out of your hands and all those things. Right? So guess what I just did? I set up a rule for you. Based on my experience, I gave you a rule, right? So now you can go into the shop and you can try to you can try to run the router, and you'll probably do fine. You're like, go against the rotation, because Ryan had a piece of wood fly across the room and darn near ripped his fingers off. Okay, so those are the types of things that that's an example of that contingency shape versus the rule governed. I have now given you the rule based on my experience. My experience was directly shaped. Right? And yours was rule following. So when you get out there into the environment and you follow my rules, it will then start to become contingency shaped. At that point, that first instance, though, is just rule following behavior. So rule governed or rule following develops by direct contact with the contingency for following rules, and eventually leads to the real contingencies, like I was just talking about. So eventually, if you follow my rules, you will come in contact with the router, and then you will get reinforced for proper use of the router automatically, simply because of the fact that you're using it, and now the contingencies are kicking in place. Okay. This bridges certain gaps, okay, and that delayed reinforcement stuff, because the potential for a lot of punishers are there, the potential for the reinforcement is there, but if without those rules, you might not come into contact with that reinforcer right off the bat, because you might make a bunch of mistakes. And the fear is that if you're going to make a bunch of mistakes, then maybe the behavior isn't going to last very long. And I know I've kind of put this in the context of woodworking, but you could also think about this in the context of, say, learning a language. I before E except after C in sometimes certain situations, and other ones, and blah blah blah, because English just sucks. But you get the idea that there's that rule, I before E except after C, for the most part. But when you get out there and start running into the contingencies, it'll then start to shape up the real response. More rules. Obey, yes, you must do this. Okay. Helpful when rapid changes are needed. Of course, you have to assume that the learner has already learned to follow rules. That's an important thing, because a lot of people have learned that rule following doesn't help them. Okay? Contingency shape takes a while. All right? You want to run into those reinforcers and those punishers yourself, it's going to take you a little bit of time to get that behavior up to speed. Right? So this is why teaching works. This is one of those, actually I should say instruction. This is why instruction works. And you heard my lovely screaming cat in the background. He's dying to come into the room. So anyway, so contingency shape can and do take time. So rules will help you get through something a lot quicker. Right? When consequences are delayed or intermittent, the rules will help you come into contact to make sure that you're eventually going to come into contact with them. If I don't put those rules out there, then you're kind of not going to know if what you're doing is right, because the consequences are delayed, or the reinforcers are delayed, or the punishers are delayed, that type of thing. So following those rules helps you come in contact with stuff. My example with this one, believe it or not, is actually, once again, guess what? Woodworking, yay! But like finish, right? So the finish that you put on a project when you're done, right? So some people call it varnish, some people call it whatever they want to call it, but there's all sorts of different types of finishes. Well, some of those finishes take forever to set up. And by set up, I mean dry and become shiny and do all those things. So what happens is that you can do the first 2, 3, 4 coats before you get to that final coat where you're really going to get a nice polish on it, nice sheen on it, and that type of thing. But if you buggered up step 1, you're not going to know about it. Believe it or not, you're not going to know about it until you're on step 5, unless you're following the rules, right? So in other words, if you forget to fill the grain, which is the little porous, there's in really hard woods, there's this porous part of the wood, and the grain actually has gaps in it, and it's where the water travels through the tree. But those gaps can look really awful on a finished product. Think of like a violin or a guitar. You notice how they look so shiny and so smooth? They're like baby's butt smooth or glass smooth. That's because one of the things that's happened is a grain filling process. They filled that grain before they start putting the finish on. Now, if you don't fill the grain, that first coat of finish, the second coat, the third coat, the fourth coat, the fifth coat, it's going to look beautiful. It's going to look just fine. And then you get to that last coat, and you're buffing things out, right? And you're working on, and you've been at this point on, like, let's say a violin or a guitar, you've been actually working on that finish for probably 25 or 30 days by the time you get to coat 5. And so you're buffing away, you're doing all this stuff, and you're making it work. And then you get done, and you're like, wow, it's nice and shiny. And you take it out in the sunlight, and all you see are these little ripples, little tiny ripples, little divots here and there, right? And you're like, son of a, And what the issue is, you didn't fill your grain. So the finish soaks in to those little bits and spots and those lower pieces. And the issue is that it looks like crap. But you didn't know that because you weren't following the rule ahead of time. So it took you forever, in this case, a month of lots of labor-intensive work to find out that you screwed something up a little while ago, and now you got to do a lot more work to fix it. Okay? So again, the consequences are delayed or imminent or intermittent there, and you use the rule to bridge the gap. So now when any of you are trying to do a French polish technique, fill your grain. So I'm giving you all these useful rules. Hopefully some of you will become woodworkers and you'll actually use it. All right. Helpful when behavior will lead to severe punishment. Think of the red rocks. That's all I have to say. All right. Make rules as specific as possible in terms of behavior. Right? Circumstances and consequences. Be clear. I mean, if you're vague, then rules are pointless. I just hate the you do this or else. It's like, really, or else what? Come on, at least tell me what the hell is going to happen. Same thing with circumstances. Under certain situations, one behavior may be okay. Under a different situation, that behavior may not be okay. Tell me what it is. Make it clear. Right? As I said, you don't want confusion. Right? This will lead to no reinforcement and can decrease rule-following behavior, because don't forget that we are getting reinforced for following the rules. Right? So there is that behavior, that separate behavior that's happening every time you're learning to do another behavior. So let's say I'm giving you all this advice on woodworking and you go out in the shop and you try it and it doesn't work. Well, guess what? You're not going to follow rules from me anymore. So I'm punishing rule following behavior. So that's why I'm actually telling you real things. Right? Make reinforcement as immediate as possible. You can do this using deadlines. Right? Some people think deadlines are discriminative stimuli, and they are in a sense, but really what it is about just making setting up a situation where the reinforcers are going to be delivered. Right? And it works surprisingly well. There's a fun reference in your book that goes through that, so I'll leave you to look through that. But the idea is that simply adding a deadline can change the probability that the behavior is going to be done. Some of you are actually seeing that with this course, because I don't have deadlines on when to complete your exams. However, there are deadlines on earning the maximum possible points in the discussion. Right? So you don't have a deadline to complete your exam. You can complete it at the end of the quarter, but you will not earn extra points in the discussions. Right? So there's kind of a deadline there, but not really. And some people aren't as worried about the points from the discussion, so they're just hanging out on their exams, and that's okay. Yeah, it's up to them. But then that's what the rule is. It's really clear. So it's really clear. The consequences, the circumstances are all there. There is a kind of a deadline. If you want to get your points for the lecture, you have to have your exams done. Goals. All right. Really, goals are just special cases of rules. Right? They're basically motivational factors to kind of help you get to a certain point. And we're going to talk about motivation in an upcoming lecture. The idea is that they can help change the value of reinforcers, and by achieving a particular goal, it might actually be a reinforcer in and to itself. Right? They do similar things as rules. Like I said, they're really just special cases of rules. It specifies a particular instance of behavior, really. Right? So there are formal rules, but they're used when you're trying to achieve a long-term objective. Trying to think of an example here, like building a set of cabinets. That's not a quick thing, right? So I've been working on that quite a while. So I set individual goals, right? So I can't just say, ooh, I want my cabinets done by this date. Yeah, right, that's not going to work, right? There's like 50,000 things you need to do in order to get those cabinets finished. So I'm working on step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and I set goals each week. Here's what I want to do this week, right? So I've broken down a lot of goals to kind of bring in some additional reinforcers there. And the long-term objective, of course, is going to be having this nice, beautiful kitchen, which I'm almost done with. I'm getting really excited. Right? Self-talk is an example of a rule for now. Right? So telling myself what, just giving myself self-statements. Ooh, this piece of wood is looking good, or ooh, the door for this cabinet is looking great. Right? That's my rule for now. I can even give myself specific rules of, ooh, I'm going to focus on this particular task today. Right? And practice where we can set up that goal for later. Right? So I'm going to do 15 of these things, and then that is going to get me to my long-term goal of actually having my cabinets. Right? So the self-talk kind of gets you focused on right now, and the practice really kind of sets it up for success later. Again, just like rules, be specific in terms of behavior, consequences, settings. Right? Use mastery criteria. Surprise, surprise, I'm using mastery criteria for you guys. Got to hit that 90%, right? Make it clear about what you need to do in order to be proficient with that particular behavior. You can start to see how this would be really useful in sports and those types of things. Right? Make them public. Right? If you have a certain set of goals, tell people about them. Of course, there's some criteria about telling folks about it. You want it to be somebody that's going to help you. You want it to be somebody that's going to be around and might actually reinforce you when you do achieve your goals. But the idea is make those goals public. Post them on a wall or something. Post them in your house. Post them on the refrigerator. I had a buddy of mine. He actually had all these lifelong goals, things that he wanted to do. And it wasn't really bucket list type stuff. It was rather pragmatic. It was like pay off bill X. And what he did was he actually put these things all around his house. So when you went over to his house, you would see this stuff. And you could ask him, hey, so-and-so, I'm not going to tell his name because you'll see him, you might see him someday. Anyway, hey, so-and-so, did you get your bill paid off? Because on the wall right there, it says that you were supposed to have that done by June or whatever. Or, hey, are you getting close to that? Or, hey, maybe we shouldn't spend money, maybe we shouldn't go out partying tonight because, it looks to me like you've got this big thing that you're trying to achieve on the wall, right? So it implies these social consequences, and that he can set himself up to get punished or reinforced for achieving his goals from other people. Deadlines, right? It makes it more likely that you'll be successful, right? And give feedback. For your self-management stuff, you guys should all be graphing this stuff every day, right? Because that feedback can be completely reinforcing, right? And just like the public stuff, make a public commitment. Say what you're going to achieve by when, right? And that tends to put additional pressure on you to make it happen. All right, there you go. Talk to you soon.